So if it was a penalty, then they can't give a red card anymore, right? Is that the case?
Really?
I think
like
so.
I said, I don't...
Yeah, it's called like it's like double jeopardy. They call it. So now, if it's in the... Oh, it can be a red card if he didn't play the ball, but if he genuinely tried to play the ball and it's in the penalty box, then it's only a yellow. Which kind of doesn't make sense. For me, the frustrating thing yesterday was... in the United was the penalty. Did you see the penalty saga?
Yeah.
What a joke. So originally it was a shot that was scuffed and going wide. He kicked it. He was 3 feet away from Lindelof's hand. And they were saying, his hand's out. Dude, who runs with their hands behind the sides? He's running full pace. The guy's done a toe poke scuff into his hand. No one's reacting that quickly. It hits his hand. The ball was going off target at very, very close proximity. It's a penalty. Frustrating. Then De Gea makes a great save. Then, because he lifted his foot above the line... Dude, the guy was, on his line, pretty much. That's a shocking one. So, for me, it was just, the justice and the injustice. It doesn't take away from how bad Manchester United were. It doesn't take it away. That doesn't forgive the performance. But for me, it's extremely frustrating. The only silver lining was Donny's goal. And that's about it, really.
What a great debut.
Good debut.
Speaking of great debuts, what about last week's episode, man?
Dude.
That was insane.
Last week's episode, dude. I just want to say thank you, folks. Thanks for listening. Thanks for the support on social media. Thanks for the messages, the gifts, the Patreon. It's kind of gone crazy. It
was humbling.
I don't know how we're ever going to top that episode. That's, one to watch. If you've missed it, go and catch season 1, episode 1. FFS show. One of the best ever.
Please.
One of the best ever. I do have one comment here from one of our guests, and it's...
Where is the intro song?
Hello and welcome to episode 2, season 1 of the FFS show with your host, me, S.
This is F.
And today is an F is for football episode. In this series, we'll be doing a deep dive of football and soccer. Today is an F episode. F, what can the viewers expect today?
So I'm a big fan of football tactics. Always have been. You know how many times we've played FIFA and I annoyed the shit out of you. Just wasting 15 minutes on formation. So I kind of went back to the early period of the Champions League of the European competition and wanted to see what were the dominant styles of football over each era and how one would sort of transition into the next, how the different or contradictory types of football would affect one another and force change.
Nice. That's super interesting. I've always known you've had a strong passion for football tactics. So, we'll be starting in the 60s today and moving through all the way through the 90s. Sounds super interesting. Yep. All right, folks, let's get settled. F, roll the show. This week's podcast isn't sponsored by gender reveal parties.
European football started, when the continental competition started. You basically it was dominated by Madrid and Benfica. I think Madrid won the first 5 or 6 consecutively, and Benfica after them. Because Madrid had a superstar team. They had Puskas, Di Stefano, Gento. I don't know if you've heard these names. Di Stefano, yeah. I think, yeah. So big names. wasn't very tactical. They mostly played in what was at that time the most standard formation. It's a 3-2-4-1. It sounds alien to us now, but it was quite normal apparently at the time. And at that time, the perception was that defense is for the weak. So like smaller teams in the Spanish league and the Portuguese league, whatever, they'd always defend when they face off against Madrid. But none of the big teams tried it at that time. Until a guy called Nereo Rocco started coaching AC Milan, and he had a good player with like legends. His defensive midfielder was a guy called Giovanni Trapattoni. Maybe you've heard of him. His centre back was Cesare Maldini, Paolo Maldini's dad.
Wow.
Yeah, and so they set up like a style of play that was primarily defensive. It's called Catenaccio. And the actual translation, Catenaccio, means a chain. Do you know like when you go to a hotel and they have like the door chain, the door bolt?
Yeah.
To lock. Yeah.
Catenaccio. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So like a safety mechanism, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so it basically like, so what they do is they have like very rigid man marking. So every defender would like follow another player, and rapid counterattacks. They'd absorb pressure the whole time and then try to counter very quickly. So initially, like one of the wingers would play as what they call the tornante, which means a returner. And so he'd play quite withdrawn, and he'd come back and join the defensive line, which means the wide centre back or the full back, whatever you want to call him, he could play a little bit deeper than the defensive line, and he'd be what they called a libero, like a sweeper, spare man. Yeah. He'd play behind the defensive line. He's not really marking anyone. His main responsibility is to like sniff up danger, any loose balls, if one of the attacking players like beat his marker, then the libero could step up and snatch the ball. So this team, Rocco's Milan, was the first defensive side to win the Champions League. It was the third champion, like after Madrid and Benfica. They were the first defensive side to win the Champions League, and they were the first Italian side to win the Champions League, obviously. So he left after two years, and around that time, we're talking obviously early 60s, mid 60s maybe. Another like a Spanish guy called Helenio Herrera, he took over Inter Milan, and he played an even more defensive system. It was like the lineup would read 1-4-3-2. So again, the one is like the spare man, the libero, defensive line of 4, 3 midfielders, 2 attackers. One especially, and he relied on like he had a left wing back. So his left back was called Facchetti or Facchetti. I don't know how it's pronounced.
Somebody touch my spaghetti!
And he was like kind of like Roberto Carlos. Like he would bomb forward whenever they counterattack and give amazing crosses, score amazing goals. He was very crucial to like their style of play. They got 2 consecutive Champions League titles. They won it twice in a row, and they made it to a third final, which they lost in his 4 years. Helenio Herrera, the coach. And around that time, like Inter Milan became, a brand, a dominant team, and that's where the nickname Grande Inter comes from. He said, so he was the first person to like give the coach quite a big standing in football, whereas before like they weren't really important. And he says about it in hindsight, he says, and I quote, "When I started, managers carried the team's bags. I put them in the place they deserve to be, earning what they should earn."
Wow.
Yeah. So there was quite a difference between Rocco and Herrera. Personality-wise, I'm saying. Like, Rocco was like a wine-drinking romantic. He was an alcoholic, always getting drunk. Very charismatic. Everyone loved him. He left the team like being widely loved and respected. Whereas Herrera, kind of similar to like Mourinho when it comes to his personality, like quite confrontational, very disciplined, a control freak. He built this like cult of personality around himself, very manipulative. And towards the end of his reign, like the entire squad was drained. They were mentally, emotionally exhausted. And he left on bad terms. So this distance between their personalities sort of reflected in their styles. So whereas Rocco was not really as defensive, he added one extra defender to the defensive line and maybe played a bit more of a reactive style of play. Herrera was all in defense to an extreme way, which was, some neutrals would say, was
I will
really
build a
anti-football,
great
unentertaining.
wall.
In the late 60s, Rocco came back to Milan. He won another Champions League, beating an Ajax team which had a young lad called Johan Cruyff.
Wow.
So Catenaccio basically left a huge legacy in Italian football, and more importantly, in Italian football culture. One of a famous Italian coach says, from that era, he says, and I quote, "The perfect result to a football game is 0-0. That is because it is an expression of the balance between the attacks and defenses out on the field." Can you imagine how dull they were?
Yeah, I can't imagine an American now listening to this. They think, 3-2 is a dull game, whereas,
Exactly.
For us, 3-2 is a cracking game.
Yeah.
So 0-0 is a perfect game. Wow.
The epitomization of football in their eyes.
Wow.
In the Netherlands, like in the late 60s, the Netherlands saw quite a bohemian cultural revolution, very anti-establishment, anti-consumer, and that social movement in some ways led to a footballing revolution. They came up with a style of play called total football, which relied on players interchanging positions, very proactive, always attacking, always pressing as soon as they lost the ball, trying to win the ball back. And they played in an unconventional 4-3-3. The aim was to drag their man markers out of their comfortable position. So when you think about, like, we were speaking about Catenaccio, which was the dominant style of play after the Milan sides. Everyone's man marking. So in order to beat that, imagine if the striker who's being marked by a central defender would drop back to midfield. So all of a sudden, the central defender is playing in huge acres of space, a type of spatial arrangement he's not really comfortable with. He prefers like a compact, small, penalty area what they did, the Dutch team, they drag defenders out of the positions they're comfortable in order to carve out spaces, force mistakes, create spaces, and create goal scoring opportunities. So in a certain way, they relied on spatial manipulation. So when they had the ball, they'd spread out. The wide players would try to play very wide, hug the touchline, in order to stretch out defenses. And when they lost the ball, they'd press immediately, making the pitch as small as possible. Wow. Which is weirdly similar to, like, when you think about Amsterdam as a city, which is where Ajax comes from. It's a very low altitude city. There's a lot of water running through, which they had to make this very advanced, very sophisticated irrigation system, canal system, in order to maximize space they have to live in. So you can find kind of funny similarities there between Ajax and the Amsterdam city.
Are there any teams in the modern day that would play like total football that you could compare to now in the modern era?
I think many people compared it to Guardiola's Barcelona, which kind of makes sense, I suppose. In terms of, like, controlling space, keeping possession, attacking all the time. I don't recall, maybe you do, I don't recall, like, a huge emphasis on interchanging positions. Maybe like Dani Alves bombing up to sort of play as a winger. Busquets sometimes joining defense. There you could say there are like some instances.
Yeah, I think the false nine in attack could be seen as a way to cause some chaos up front.
Absolutely.
And, having an interchangeable top three, where the whole point is to drag the central defenders away from where they typically like to be, get them turning, getting them twisted. So it seems like was possession a key part of the game for total football?
Absolutely.
Because if you're chasing the ball, that's I think you mentioned, fatigue earlier. Fatigue is a huge problem.
Oh yeah.
So if you're to play total football, I can imagine you need to be masters of keeping the ball, and when you don't have the ball, if you want to do the high press and closing down the space, that's a lot of energy that goes into that style of football.
It's interesting you bring that up because I read that Rinus Michels or Michels, I'm not sure how his last name is pronounced, which is the Ajax coach. Apparently he was very interested and dedicated into fitness. So I think he was a gymnast coach, I want to say. Don't quote me on that. I think he was. And he took a lot of interest in like maintaining players' fitness, to make sure like they could outlast in terms of stamina, they could outlast their opponents, they could outrun their opponents. So yeah, I think this is also like a time, we're talking post-war, like early 70s at this stage. So probably there was no shortage of food anymore in Europe. And sports sciences, I guess, if you want to call it that, might have evolved. Nutrition, diet, all these different aspects. I mean, there was some, not to go on a tangent, but there's some people used to allege that they would give them, the coaching staff would give Ajax players methamphetamine or all these different enhancement drugs. Never been proven, but yeah, so goes the claim. So this Ajax team, after losing the final to Inter, they were vindicated. Sorry, AC Milan. They were vindicated 2 years after their final loss, winning their first ever Champions League. They actually won three consecutive titles, 3 years in a row in the early 70s. And the same team won 6 Dutch league titles in 8 years. So in the span of 8 years, they got the title, which, I mean, to our listeners maybe who don't know the difference, a cup competition relies on, there's a lot of luck. It's just one match. If you win it, you're through to the next round. If you lose it, you're out. So you have to step up in big games. But winning a league means being the most consistent team over 38 games or 30-something games over the span of a whole year. So the fact that they mastered both is quite impressive.
Extremely.
So the coach left Ajax towards I think after winning the second of the 3 Champions League titles, and was replaced by a Romanian coach called Kovac, so I don't know how it's pronounced, because he moved to the Dutch national team. He got a promotion, and as soon as he stepped up to the national team coach job, he got the Netherlands to 2 consecutive World Cup finals in 74 and 78. Unfortunately, losing both. I think they lost to Germany in the first one and Argentina in the second. But if you ask anyone who watched football at that time who they remember, which team they remember from the 1974 and 1978 World Cups, I can guarantee you the first name they're going to mention is the Dutch team with Johan Cruyff. They were mesmerizing.
Yeah. Do you think we could do another episode on this, on Dutch football and how they never won a World Cup with the amount of talent that they had? Do you think that was one of the closest World Cups they had? We look at, they lost to Spain in the final in 2008? 2010, yeah.
Yeah.
In the European Championships. But they've never won a World or even a European Championship.
It's a Greek tragedy.
Or a Dutch tragedy.
Yeah.
Very unfortunate, yeah. And I'd say they are the best team that has not won a World Cup out of all of the national teams that haven't won one. I think it's fair to say they are the best.
Agreed.
So after the Ajax era of dominance, you had Bayern, who won 3 consecutive. They matched Ajax's achievement by winning 3 consecutive titles right after Ajax. And the Bayern team had the same core as the German national team that beat Netherlands in the World Cup final as well, which was Franz Beckenbauer, if you might know. He used to play as the sweeper, the libero. Uli Hoeneß and Gerd Müller. Thomas Müller's dad or maybe granddad, I'm not sure.
Uncle, I think it might
Uncle?
be.
Huh.
I think so. Yeah, I'll look it up. I'll look it up. You continue.
Yeah. So they shifted into like a more physical style of, some call it 4-3-3, some call it 1-3-3-3, because Beckenbauer played behind the defensive line most of the time as a sweeper or libero. And also he was so technically gifted. Like he would immediately start the counterattacks, move with the ball up to midfield and spray passes to everyone. But they weren't as an attacking unit or a technical unit compared to Ajax or the Dutch team. They relied on physicality. But English clubs afterwards, they took physicality to the next level. They were always a physical, the English footballing culture is, always like, get in there, boy, get a tackle kind of thing. I can't do a British accent, I'm sorry. But so it was always kind of like this weird rugby footballing culture, always admired hard work, running up and down, a strong tackle. But what changed is that after, I think it's in the late 60s or maybe early mid-70s, I'm not sure, Bill Shankly, the Liverpool coach, after losing to Red Star Belgrade in the Champions League, he realized the thing that made them better was that their defenders were actually quite gifted technically. They could pass the ball, they could immediately start great counterattacks. Whereas in England, all of the centre-backs were always called stoppers. They'd just be big, brutal, forces of nature. So he shifted one midfielder to a central defender and sought out another central defender. And all of a sudden, this Liverpool team had very technical defensive line who could also defend, don't get me wrong. And they played a very good 4-4-2. And in 11 years, 9 finals had at least one English team.
Wow.
Consecutively. Well, actually not consecutively. 6 of them were consecutive, but 9 and 11 overall. And 7 of which were victories. 7 of the 9. It was kind of this multifaceted hybrid of more or less all of the different styles we talked about before. You had a lot of physical pressing, but also they had a lot of patience and technique with the ball. So they could play the ball. Usually they'd pass it around the back line and maybe with the defensive midfielders, waiting for the wingers or the strikers to run into space as soon as the other team got impatient and started attacking them. As soon as any opportunity was there, any space opened up, the runner would immediately run into space and someone would find him and they'd be clear on goal immediately. It was an explosive style of football, mastered predominantly by the guy who took over after Bill Shankly, Paisley and Brian Clough. Paisley with Nottingham and Paisley with Liverpool and Clough with Nottingham Forest. After Paisley left Liverpool, another guy called, I think he was one of his assistants, he was in his coaching staff, Joe Fagan, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. He inherited more or less the same squad, and in 1984 became the first English team to win the treble, which means winning your local league, winning your local cup, and winning the European Cup or the Champions League. This dynasty ended in 85 when Liverpool lost against Juventus, which was also marred by the Hazel Stadium disaster. I think 79 people, unfortunately, fans, were killed in an altercation, and also I think the floor crumbled on the ceiling, fell on the spectators in the lower floor. It was very tragic, and I think all English teams were banned. How long do you know how long it was? That they were banned, maybe 10 years or 5 years. They were banned from participating in Europe. So that marked the end. That unfortunately marked the end of the English era. Interestingly, the team who beat Liverpool in that final were towards the end of their dynasty, and we're talking about Juventus. So in the mid-70s, the movement, the physicality, the pressing of total football and the Germans and the English kind of overwhelmed Catenaccio. Catenaccio became a thing of the past. And man marking obviously was stopped becoming a thing, because more or less the English, the Dutch, They all played, if not full-on zonal marking, whereas the difference obviously being everyone had a zone to protect in defense rather than being allocated a single opposition player. If not full-on zonal, then some sort of hybrid between man marking and zonal marking. So Italy's response was a new style of football called zona mista, also called Giocco All'Italiana, which means the Italian way. So they basically lined up in a 3-4-1-2. 3 defenders, 4 midfielders, 1 Trequartista, which we'll get to, and 2 strikers up front. Like I said, it was a very hybrid defensive mix. You had elements of higher pressing compared to like just sitting deep and absorbing pressure from Catenaccio. You had a mix of zonal and man marking. You still had a sweeper in the back 3, one libero who played a bit deeper, and occasionally players would exchange positions. Similarly to the German mold, the libero or the sweeper or the spearman had to be technical at this point. He had to be very good with the ball. He'd step up into midfield during possession, which when you think about it sort of molded the team shape with the ball into a 2-3-5. If one of the three defenders would step up to midfield, and then the 2 wing backs would join attack. Which, when you think about this 2-3-5, that's basically how Liverpool and City today, that's their attacking shape. As soon as they have the ball, it's a two centre backs, 3 with City it's the Fernandinho and the 2 wing backs. With Liverpool it's the 3 midfielders, and then you had 5 in attack. Trapattoni, his name, he was the coach who mastered. I don't want to say he invented it, but he definitely was the one who mastered this style of playing. So the one behind the 2 that I just mentioned, the Trequartista or the number 10, was the most important player in this whole team. He was, whereas everyone in the team had very rigid instructions of what to do on the ball, what to do off the ball, where to be, where to position themselves. The Trequartista, which means the third quarter, had a completely free role. He could join the midfield line, he could drop deep, he could join the attack, he could make a run in behind, he could do whatever he wanted. And he's usually the best player, the most technical player, the most brilliant player on the team. Juventus initially had an Irishman called Liam Brady. He was their Trequartista, their number 10. He got Juventus their first Serie A title, their first league title when with Trapattoni. Wasn't their first overall, but after like the Milan dominance, and Trapattoni came in, he won the league back with Liam Brady. But then after losing a final, I think, or just generally down the line, because Trapattoni, he stayed for 10 years. He had a long reign with Juventus. He eventually upgraded him to Michel Platini, who's currently the UEFA president, I think. Platini was, at the time, he was the best player of his generation. He won 3 consecutive Ballon d'Ors, which means award for the best player in the world. And he got Juventus to 2 Champions League finals.
If anyone listening to this episode, if they don't know what the Ballon d'Or is and they've got this far, we just have to commend them. So, well done. If you don't know what the Ballon d'Or is.
So there was a big emphasis on the Trequartista or the number 10. You had Platini at Juventus killing it. You had Maradona with Napoli. He was at Napoli. He sort of took over the mantle as the best number 10. And then later on, as we got to the early 90s, you had Roberto Baggio, who became sort of the poster boy of the number 10. What's interesting is that in 1982, so towards the rise of Juventus, not really their apex, not really their peak, but an Italy team won the World Cup in 1982. And they were to say they were underdogs would be an understatement. You had a legendary Brazil team, you had a legendary Argentina team with Maradona, you had a very good English team at the peak of the English dominance. Germany were doing very well. Everyone thought one of these 4 would get it, but the underdogs Italy managed to win it with what they called Blocco Juve, which means basically a core of Juventus players who were all Italians. And they managed to get Italy the World Cup playing Giocco All'Italiana.
Wow.
After 10 years, unfortunately, Trapattoni left Juventus, having won 6 Italian league titles in his 10 years, 1 Champions League title, and 2 finals, I think. One of which he won, the other one he lost. He was the first to win a European treble, which basically means the Champions League, the UEFA Cup, and the Confederations Cup, I believe. After Trapattoni left Juventus in 85 or 86, Juventus would not win the title again for another 10 years.
Wow.
So around this stage, basically, Giocco All'Italiana had become hegemonic. Serie A, the Italian league, was at the height of its dominance. It was so competitive. You had the Seven Sisters, kind of like the Big Six in the Premier League today. Inter Milan, AC Milan, Napoli, Juventus, Roma, Lazio, and I think Parma, maybe Sampdoria, I'm not sure. So Milan was just purchased by one Silvio Berlusconi. So this guy, he bought Milan. They had only won a single Italian league title in 20 years. So they were not doing too well. So they played I think a second division or a third division side in a cup match in an Italian cup tournament. And even though Milan won, but Berlusconi was very impressed with the opposition and more importantly, the way they played. Their coach was a former shoe salesman who only coached in the second or third division as a hobby. Like, he made more money selling shoes than he did coaching football. His name is Arrigo Sacchi. Growing up, he used to love the Dutch teams, so he sort of modeled his style of play after them. He built an insane pressing side and very religiously into zonal marking, and they'd always line up in a 4-4-2. He played with an extremely high line, so their defenders would always play very high up the pitch when they had the ball, and they perfected the offside trap. They were best in the game at doing the offside trap, always catching teams offside. You can't even counterattack against them. As soon as they lost the ball, they'd press you like a pack of wolves. As soon as he took over, he asked for 3 Dutchmen. Obviously, at the time, I think teams only were permitted to start with 3 non-local players. So you had to have basically 8 Italian players and 3 non-Italians. So he asked for 3 Dutchmen to be his non-Italian signings: Frank Rijkard, Guillit, and Marco van Basten.
Wow.
To go along with his Italian core, which included a very young Paolo Maldini, the son of Cesar, Franco Baresi, Carlo Ancelotti played in this
Antonio
team.
Margareti.
And as soon as he got these Dutch players, he knew that he needed some Dutch heads to help him implement this style. He says about the Dutch football, and I quote, "I think they were different from us," speaking about the Dutch teams. They were based more on athleticism. We were more about tactics. Every player had to be in the right place. In the defensive phase, all of our players always had 4 reference points: the ball, the space, the opponent, and his teammates. Every movement had to be a function of those 4 reference points. Each player had to decide which of the 4 reference points should determine his movement. Pressing is not about running, and it's not about working hard. It's about controlling space. I wanted my players to feel strong and the opponents to feel weak. If we let our opponents play in a way they were accustomed to, they would grow in confidence. But if we stopped them, it would hurt their confidence. That was the key. Our pressing was psychological as much as it was physical. Our pressing was always collective. I wanted all 11 players to be in an active position, affecting and influencing the opposition when we did not have the ball. Every moment had to be synergistic and had to fit into the collective goal. So it required, as we said, a lot of running, a lot of hard work. When he first joined, a lot of his star players, particularly the ones he just bought, the Dutch stars, they were not really convinced with the hard workload that he expected from his players, particularly being a shoe salesman. Not at this time, you have to keep in mind, most coaches, until this day, most coaches were former players, in many cases big name football players. So, who is this shoe salesman to tell me Van Basten, the best player in the world, what I should do and how I should run and how I should work hard? So the way he convinced them was he asked them to do a drill, like a training drill, where he said, "Trust me, 10 unorganized players can't beat 5 organized players." So he set up the whole attacking team to play against his backline, which had Maldini, Costa Corta, Baresi, some of the most legendary names in Italian football, and the goalkeeper. So 4 defenders and a goalkeeper versus 10 players. He said, if you can't score for 15 minutes, that means I'm right. And they couldn't. They didn't manage in 15 minutes to score against just 4 players, and they were 10. Wow. That's how organized his style was. They'd move collectively, they'd press, they'd hound. They were unbelievable. So another thing to keep in mind is that at this time, like we said, number 10 or Trequartista was very in vogue. It was very popular. And he played without one, with his 4-4-2, something which the Italian press didn't really like. Not only did they not like the fact that he didn't have a number 10, they also didn't like his overall style. Because, as we said before, you remember the quote, 0-0 is the most favorable match in pundits' opinions, Italian pundits. They romanticized defending. They romanticized football. To them was like chess. So most importantly is to negate your opposition rather than to try and attack or please the audience. He only managed one league title, but he won 2 consecutive Champions Leagues. Interestingly enough, they were the last team to defend the Champions League title. So they were the last team to win it consecutively for almost 25 years. Only a few years ago broken by Zidane's Madrid. In the semi-finals, in one of their victories, they beat Madrid 5-0 at home. And it was a masterclass that to this day is still taught as a lesson in pressing. They beat one of the best sides in the world. They destroyed them 5-0. This guy, he changed Italian football. He changed world football forever. Similarly to what I said about the Ajax team, if you ask anyone who watched football in the late 80s or early 90s, which team they remember, I can guarantee you the answer is going to be AC Milan. They're still talked about to this day as one of the greatest teams of all time.
To this day!
On the discussion of the greatest teams of all times, on our next F is for Football show, I think one of the top of the weeks that we will do is our top 5 teams of all time in European football. Ooh. So I'm looking forward to hearing about this in more detail. Some of the players who played on this team, some of the tactics.
I like that. Yeah, I think
folks
that would
look
be
out for that in the next F is for Football.
Yeah. But yeah, so Sacchi was more or less the end of my episode for today. On the next F is for Football episode, we're going to talk about how it developed from the 90s up until the modern day.
Can't wait. And one thing that we were talking about earlier was the Hazel Stadium disaster. So the English clubs were banned for 5 years and Liverpool was banned for 6 years after that. Oh. So what do you think, if that hadn't have happened, what could have been the knock-on effects for football? And
I think for starters, because it's funny when you get isolated, because there's this weird dialectical relationship in terms of style in football. So you saw, I guess, with these 30 years, how it's always one style of play would influence another, and then they'd always sort of affect each other and change each other. So to be isolated from elite competition, as elite English teams, I'm not going to speak for lower division teams or mid-table teams, but the elites, to not being able to be in that competition and to see how they were playing and to play against them, I think most importantly, tactically put them quite behind the European elite teams. I think financially must have had a lot of implications. So if I'm not mistaken, I don't think a single English team would ever win the Champions League until Ferguson. Am I correct? Until 99, I think, or 98.
Let's have a look. So the last time, so Liverpool won in 81.
Yeah, and 84.
United won in 67. So 84, and then 85 is the disaster, and then the next English team
in the final,
it's 2004.
90? No, it's 99. United
20 years.
99 United when they won the treble, yeah. So I mean that in itself probably answers your question about how much of an impact that had. It was huge.
So that's 15 years of not being in a final, whereas just before we discussed, they were regularly in a final every other year, it seems like. So one thing that we didn't mention, one thing that we didn't get into too much in this episode that we could definitely touch back on, and it's just something as I'm looking at the winners is standing out. So 1985, 1986, Steaua Bucharest win the European League. Now that seems like an era where Romanian football was really strong for both the national team and their leagues.
Yeah, I'm guessing.
I don't know much about it.
This team might have had Giorgio Hagi. Let me check it quickly. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was a legend. Of Romanian football. But yeah, I mean, there's certain small anomalies. Obviously, I couldn't get all of. There's probably a few dominant eras that I didn't mention, because you can't really sum it up in half an hour or so. But I tried to cover the most important ones. And
so let's do a future series episode on the unlikely Champions League winners of the last 50 years, and we can talk about Celtic, we can talk about there's a few really good teams that we can talk about and what happened there and how that happened.
Yeah, always you gotta love a good underdog story, but always warms your heart.
Absolutely. Well, that was super interesting. Thanks, F, for that main bulk today. Appreciate it. Okay, now it's time for top 6. So as the Premier League has started last week and we're in game 2, we're going to be looking at the top 6 and where we think they're going to be finishing this year. So just to give a quick introduction on the teams that we like, I am a lifelong Manchester United fan. Hopefully we can try and be as non-biased as possible or unbiased as possible. Not always going to be possible. If you don't like it, we don't care that much. So
they ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
F, what team do you like?
So I'm at the moment, I don't really have any allegiance to any team, but at the moment I'd say maybe the last few years I've been a Liverpool fan. Klopp has won me over. But I also like Chelsea. I like where they're going. I kind of like the signings they made. So if I had to pick my favourites in the Premier League, I'd say number 1 Liverpool, number 2 Chelsea, or maybe even a tie.
Okay, good stuff. I think that that's a pretty neutral international viewpoint. I have a lot of friends internationally outside of the UK who would have a similar view to that. So I think that's a good mix, and hopefully people's hatred of Manchester United won't be too off-putting on this show. So
because we suck now.
We suck now. So I think hopefully we should be a less hated team. And
I used to hate United during the Ferguson years, but you can't really hate a team that's not dominating. That's usually where my hatred is aimed.
Agreed. And I find that Liverpool, though, isn't as hated, even though they are dominating right now in Europe and, in the league. I just feel like they're not that hated. Do you agree with that? And if not, and if you do agree, why do you think why they aren't as hated as much?
I think it comes down to two things. One being the fact that they haven't won in was it 30 years? So that definitely, there is an underdog element there. And just how they've been floundering for the past 10, 15 years. They haven't really been up to much. Also, I think the fact that they're not winning in an era of super clubs, in an era of like increasing financial inequality in football, like the fact that they haven't outmuscled their way to the top through outspending everyone, I think also gives them this kind of underdog element, unlike, say, City, who, for me, like they they overtook United for the past 5 years, I'd say, as the maybe the only team in the top 6 that I don't like. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So I think it would be nice to start off. We said we do our surprise package before we get into the top 6. So who do you think, most likely outside of the top 6, who do you think, or it could be someone from the top 6, who do you think is going to be the biggest surprise this season in the Premier League?
I think it's going to be Leeds. We can go into this in another episode for Efforts for Football, but I think for me it's got to be Leeds. They're super exciting, super young. Their manager is hot right now. The first couple of games they played, they were unlucky in the Liverpool game, I thought, and game 1, and they won pretty darn convincingly in game 2. So for me, it would be Leeds would be the surprise package for this year.
Nice.
How about you?
I went with I want to say, my heart wants to say Leeds, but I'm always a cynic, so I always, when it's something I want, my rational side goes against it. So I want to say Leeds emotionally, but realistically, I think it's going to be Everton. I think Everton are going to be last season's Leicester. So they might challenge for the top 4. Maybe if not the top 4, they might challenge for the top 6, maybe 5th or 6th. I think Ancelotti's got a very good team going. I think they're quite balanced now that he's got Allen, now that he's got James Rodriguez. Mm-hmm. So I think they're gonna.
Yeah, I think that they're 2 pretty obvious choices for surprise. It'll be interesting to see how they do. So let's jump into the big 6. So we know they're not necessarily the top 6 of last year. We know that Leicester were in that, but we're going to look at the big 6 clubs. So Arsenal, Tottenham, Chelsea, United, City and Liverpool. We'll start off with the bottom club, Arsenal. How do we think they've strengthened so far? And where do you think they're going to be?
So I think the most obvious candidates would be the North London clubs for 5 and 6. I think Arsenal, Tottenham, but I guess the question will come down to who do we think is going to do better than the other? If you asked me last week after the first match day, I would have said Arsenal. But after watching the Tottenham's match today, maybe Mourinho's onto something. Who knows?
Okay, so let's do it like this. Let's do who's going to be in the 6th position out of the top 6. So they might actually be 8th, but I'm just saying in reference to those clubs, who's going to finish on the bottom of the pile? Arsenal or Tottenham or Manchester United, realistically. And folks, we got to get a consensus here, so we might not agree. So I want to hear F's proposal first. Who comes in 6th?
I think it's going to be Arsenal. I really like Arteta. I like what they're doing, but I just think they, maybe in terms of depth, maybe they're the weakest next to United, arguably. Mm-hmm. I don't know. And it's going to be
They have strengthened this year with Willian, so that's, how many points do you think that's going to make them? I think that's their big transfer this summer.
Willian and that young defender, I don't know his name, but he did very well in the first 2 matches. I think he's going to prove to be their signing of the season. But Willian is definitely going to have an impact. I think he's going to win them a lot of points. They look more solid than I remember ever seeing Arsenal, which helps to get you points, push you up the league. But I think in terms of defense, Mourinho definitely has a better defense, and from a playing style perspective rather than on paper. So I think Mourinho's going to edge out Arteta. Arsenal are going to finish 6th, Tottenham 5th. What do you think?
I would agree with Arsenal being in 6th. I don't think they've strengthened enough, and I think they were really, really poor last year. I think Tottenham, with the signing of Bale, which looks like it's about to be confirmed, I am now scared for United in terms of getting top 4. So I would say 5th and 4th battle would be between United and Tottenham. Right now, as it stands with the transfers, if no more transfers happen right now, I would actually fancy Tottenham. I think,
Yeah.
you know, with Gareth Bale, that added power, and, you know, Mourinho with a little bit more time, he can be an effective manager. He might not be the most beautiful manager. We could probably have a whole episode about just Mourinho and the evolution of Mourinho. But I think right now I put United in 5th and I put Tottenham in 4th if United don't get anyone else. That could change. If Sancho comes in, if we get a centre-back, if we get a good right-back, good left-back, then maybe that could change. But just watching them yesterday, it was so poor. It was so bad. Opening defeat to Crystal Palace. Right now I put Arsenal 6th, United 5th, Tottenham 4th.
I agree. I think if the transfer window shut as is, then I think Tottenham would finish 4th. But I was playing on the assumption that United will strengthen. Maybe not Sancho, maybe not the signings, the A-list signings, but I think they have money to spend. They're one of the richest clubs. So I definitely think they will strengthen just enough to edge them past Tottenham.
Okay, so what are we going to do? Are we going to assume from now or assume they're going to buy? I like your confidence. I don't have the same confidence in the ownership of United to get the deal done for anyone. I could, you know, right now I feel like it's 50-50 whether we're going to get a first team signing, someone who's going to slot into the first team. So if it's not Sancho, someone who's better than what we have now. Okay, let's be optimistic. I'd say let's put Tottenham 5th and United 4th, assuming that they will get someone, and Tottenham are pretty much set with their team. Okay. All right, then we're going to go top 3. So we've agreed on Chelsea and Liverpool and City getting the top 3 places. Yeah. I think that's pretty understandable. United have only got Donny van de Beek in, whereas Man City have already got Torres, Ake, they got Carson and Moreno on loan, which isn't as strong as obviously Chelsea. They've brought in some massive names into the club, which is going to be super exciting for the Premier League this year.
It
You've
is.
got Werner, Ziyech, Ben Chilwell, Malang Sarr from Nice, Thiago Silva, which we can have a discuss about quickly, and Havertz from Leverkusen, which is just an insane transfer window from Chelsea. They were obviously banned for a little while, right? So this is
they had money to spend.
No surprise
they had a lot
that
of
come in
liquidity.
big.
But this kind of reminds me of Abramovich's first transfer window. As soon as when Mourinho came, and he basically essentially rebuilt the entire squad. And this kind of looks similar. What's interesting is that they already have quite okay, I'm not going to say solid, but like a good foundation. So it would be interesting to see. I don't think they're going to challenge for the title this season. So I have them down as a 3rd. I think they're going to close the gap down. Perhaps maybe towards the end of the season, we're going to start to see the team gelling better. All of these new players settling in, Lampard settling on his favorite lineup, or even rotating effectively. But I think they're going to drop points early on, and that's going to eliminate them from the title race effectively. But I think they will close the gap to the top 2, and at the same time, I think they will have a comfortable distance between them and 4th, unlike last season.
I agree with a comfortable distance between them and United, Tottenham and Arsenal. I think it'll be closer to Liverpool and City. I think they'll be looking at the Premier League as their main target this year. I think their team is super strong. It's got depth. I think Liverpool are going to find the weight of being champions in the Premier League. I think that's going to be something. And I just can't see Man City. I think it's going to be very close between those 3 clubs. I think it's going to be very, very... And I don't think anyone's going to fly away this year. I think Liverpool are going to have a hiccup after winning the league. I don't think they're going to just go back-to-back on their streak that they're running at the moment. They could. I'm not saying they can't. I'm saying they could, but I don't think they will. I think City haven't done enough in the transfer yet to make me think that they're good enough to beat Liverpool or consistently be better than Liverpool. And I think Chelsea have strengthened massively. So, you know, for me, it's such a... I don't even know... it could be any three of them. I'd actually put City in my third place if I was picking it by myself, and I'd put Chelsea second, Liverpool first, but just.
I surprisingly, we're not in agreement with any of the three, because I would have put City as champions this season. Liverpool second, Chelsea third.
I looked at some of the experts online and what they predicted, and it's a lot of Man City. But what is that based on? What's the confidence? Is that just because you think Liverpool won't be as good? Why do you think City
I think they
will
have
do
much better
better?
depth. I think they have much better depth for starters, and I think Guardiola will not they have something to prove. After losing last season, I think they might have a bit more determination than Liverpool, similar to what Liverpool showed last season. That heartbreak of missing out, particularly missing out quite embarrassingly for City standards last season. So I think they're going to want to prove their doubters wrong. I think Phil Foden is going to have a good season. I think Sterling is, if not reached, is getting closer to his peak, his prime. Same with De Bruyne. I think they were very unlucky with Laporte being injured last season. I think he most likely will have a better season, at least have much bigger presence this year. And I think that with Liverpool's probable complacency will determine, let City edge out for the race.
I'm going to have to agree with you then. I think we've got our FFS top 6. So champions elect are City, less injuries, more heart, more, fire in the belly. We think Liverpool are going to have a good, strong season. They have an amazing team. They have an amazing manager. We just think that winning back-to-back Premier Leagues is tough. Especially last season was a crazy season for them. Must have taken a lot emotionally out of them. And obviously they'll be looking at Europe big time this year. And then Chelsea, I think, we both think they're going to close the gap. How close are they going to get? Or even jump one of those two big teams above them? We don't know. They have the team for it. They have the team to do it. I don't think it would be a surprise if they did do it, based on the teams. It's just maybe the speed at which they do it. Maybe they're looking at next 2 seasons to challenge. United are, doing really poorly. For me, I think they need to spend big and spend now and make statement buys. Right now it's just doesn't look good for Manchester United. The fans aren't happy. I don't think Ole Gunnar Solskjaer is too happy. A lot of pressure on the owners and on Ed Woodward as well. Yeah,
time will tell. Do you think one closing question? Do you think Lampard has what it takes to actually win the title? I think that's key. That's the main source of my doubt, to be honest. I love him. Loved him as a player. I think he did an amazing job last season, but I just don't have him.
For me, I think Lampard, just being a United fan growing up, especially in the era when Chelsea were winning Premier Leagues, for me, I feared his brain more than I feared his talent. And I always thought his football reading and his timing and where he was to be in the box and his tempo, the pace, I think that's his best asset as a player. So I actually think as a manager, he's definitely got the intelligence. I definitely got the work ethic. Is he going to do it this year? Maybe not. I don't think he's developed yet. It probably would have been good for him to do a few more years with a big club. But the other thing to say in that, sometimes they won't work at a championship level. Sometimes these elite players, they only understand Premier League. They only understand Champions League. So to say that they should go to like a League 2, League 3 team to learn doesn't always work. It's not the same style of football. It's not the same challenges that you have with the media and the owners and big money and big egos. So I think if Chelsea are smart, they will give him some time. We know Chelsea. As soon as he starts to fail, he'll be gone. But we'll see. Yeah, but I think he's definitely smart enough to do the job.
Yeah.
All right, there we have it, folks. We have a top 6. We have City, Liverpool, Chelsea, United, Tottenham, Arsenal. We'll see. We'll touch base on this. We'll make a record and we'll see how we get on, and see if we change our mind during the mid-season.
Yeah, it would be interesting to revisit that.
100%. All right. Well, that's it, folks. Thanks for tuning in to the FFS show. We've been your hosts, FNS. Please make sure to like, subscribe and join. Our social media is linked in the description. And until next time, thank you and goodbye.